1.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great event on tap here for you, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use that question and answer tab on your interface and submit your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have a very interactive chat feature, so we do encourage you to chat us out, your suggestions, questions, comments, whatever you want to share with us. We'll be more than happy to keep an eye on that chat and perhaps chat you back. And then also at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is exploring an integrated DevOps workflow in SAP. Our speakers today are Peter Yabsley, who is the head of product marketing at Basis Technologies, and Aaron Craigsauer, who is the SAP DevOps architect at Basis Technologies. Peter, Aaron, thank you both for joining me today. Really do appreciate it.
Great to be here. Great to be here, and thanks to everybody for joining us on this DevOps.com webinar. Great to be here with you all today. Just to recap those intros there and give a little bit more detail. My name is Peter Yabsley. I am the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. I'm joining you from a rather dark evening in London in the UK here tonight, and I'll be taking us through the first part of today's presentation. A few of the details there, and then I'm going to hand over for an important part of that. We'll talk about agenda in a second to my colleague Aaron, who's joining us here today, who's worked for many years in the arena of software development, both inside and outside of SAP. Aaron, do you want to just give a short introduction to yourself for our audience?
Yeah, so over 20 years in software development. Actually, most of it is not really SAP, more of the Java and .NET side, and so very used to traditional DevOps, if you will, but the last few years I've been here with Basis Technologies, focusing on bringing DevOps to SAP, and so we're looking forward to talking with you all and explaining how that really works.
Okay, great, thanks, Aaron. Well, let's get started. Let's take a quick look at today's agenda, very high level. We're going to talk a little bit. We're going to have a little bit of discussion here about why it's worthwhile for people who don't work inside of SAP, who aren't in that particular tech stack, to care about how SAP is working and how software development delivery can operate inside of the SAP space. We're going to talk a little bit about some SAP specific DevOps considerations, because as we will discuss, SAP is a bit of a different world in some important ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of how SAP can fit potentially into an integrated DevOps pipeline. And then, as I've mentioned, for maybe the most important part of today's session, Aaron's going to take us through an example, a high-level example of a real-life concept of that kind of integrated pipeline, including SAP development in there with your other tools as well, before we have a bit of a wrap-up and that Q&A that was just mentioned at the start there. So before we begin, I appreciate that not everybody on the call might be completely familiar with us as a company, at Basis Technologies as a company. So a quick introduction to us and to why we're here talking to you about this topic today. So basically, we create automation software that helps our customers, some of the biggest companies and brands in the world, to change the way that they maintain and adapt and manage their SAP systems, the kind of critical SAP systems that run the operational processes on which a lot of their businesses depend, from manufacturing to supply chain to finance and so on. We're really the pioneers of the area of DevOps and continuous delivery in those kind of core SAP systems, and we're enabling those kind of companies that you can see on the screen to change their approach and adopt things like Agile and DevOps through our DevOps and test automation platform, which is software that is very importantly, and you'll hear about that in today's presentation, very importantly, engineered specifically for some of those requirements of SAP. We've been around for quite some time now, nearly 25 years, and we operate really within the realm of SAP. So we are kind of experts in that field, but increasingly we recognize that the organizations we work with are trying to connect delivery pipelines and enterprise applications together more than ever before. And that's why we're here having this conversation today about how you might think about that and you might facilitate that in your organizations. And as you can see, we've got a global presence, so we've got offices around the world. Erin's joining us from Dallas in Texas today. As I've mentioned, I'm in the UK. We've also got offices in Europe and Australia. Clients all around the world at different stages of their Agile and DevOps journeys, but certainly this topic of integration and how we can bring DevOps together in SAP with other teams who are already working that way outside of SAP is one that's growing in interest and importance. So let's start with that topic of why we should care, why everybody really, or we believe, should care about what's happening in SAP, particularly in these organizations where it's the kind of bedrock for a lot of the foundational processes. And let's start with just talking about DevOps itself. Okay, so we've got some numbers here on the screen. Some of you may be very familiar with this screen grab and these exact numbers. This is from the DORA State of DevOps report that they published a couple of years ago before they were purchased by Google. And these were the kind of outcomes that they were suggesting that their elite performers, the more advanced DevOps organizations, are going to deliver. And I'm sure this kind of thing is no surprise to those of you who are DevOps practitioners and who are seeing the benefits of those kind of approaches day to day. And it's easy to make the assumption, DevOps is so widespread now, it's not everywhere, but it's a very commonly recognized approach, and it's certainly gaining in momentum in the past few years. It's easy to assume that this is standard and this is how everyone is working. And the fact is, actually, maybe even in your organization, that might not be the case. And certainly when we look at how SAP teams work, we might find some differences there. And I think, Erin, that's going to bring us to our first kind of illustration today of how SAP can differ from the rest of IT. It's a pretty fundamental gap, actually. It's where I really want to bring your input into this conversation today. You're dealing with companies day to day, kind of all over the US. Would it be fair to say that this idea of highly automated on-demand software delivery that's kind of the typical DevOps concept isn't really in a lot of the SAP world just yet?
That's right, Peter. So we talked to a lot of companies who they're released just a couple times a year, maybe once a quarter, and maybe even just once a month. And they feel like they're going really fast if they're releasing once a month, right? But they do have, want to be able to release a lot faster. It's just that there's some challenges with being able to do that in SAP that we'll go through in more detail later on.
And of course we're making a big generalization here on this slide. There's a whole spectrum of approaches to SAP as there are to other applications. But the point to make here, particularly if you're working in other spheres and you're not necessarily directly connected with SAP typically, is that this kind of cadence isn't a surprise. I was talking to a very big global organization today who've just moved from a quarterly release cycle for their SAP system. So only 4 times a year could they deliver real new functionality before they adopted more of an agile DevOps model, which is where they've moved to. So, certainly this is a real kind of mindset difference, perceptual difference, and there are some good reasons for this, some good historical reasons, but certainly this is starting to change, but it's really something to be aware of. And it's one of the, I guess, main drivers of why there's interest in connecting SAP to these DevOps pipelines. So I think, we've got some sort of proof of why that matters as well in this slide from IDC's 2020 DevOps survey, where the people they spoke to identified integration into what they called legacy applications was the main bottleneck for effective application delivery, in a DevOps approach. And Erin, although I suppose some people might argue with calling SAP legacy software, I think that's certainly how it can be perceived, especially, where it's well established. is this graph kind of reflecting what you hear from the people you're speaking to?
Yeah, so essentially, SAP is the core backend systems. The ERP, it's where everything ties to the general ledger, and especially for these large organizations, you can think of it as a classic monolithic application. Lots of moving parts to it, lots of functionality wrapped into one application itself. So if there are other, smaller applications that rely upon the backend system and the integration to it, well, these microservices, if you will, or small, cool front ends for it, those can change pretty quickly. But if they have a dependency on a change in that legacy system, okay, you may be waiting a few months for that overall change to go into place because of the slow pace of delivery to that SAP's backend system.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think if we just click on to our next slide, that's that's what we're illustrating here with these athletes with SAP trying to catch up. But I think it's important to note as well that we're seeing more of a shift. We're seeing more interest in the concepts of DevOps in the world of SAP, and those teams are often looking for how they can leverage the expertise of people who've been doing this for longer and have more of a track record there. But we're expecting this maybe to grow in importance in coming years as the architecture of SAP changes and the product offer there evolves as well.
Yeah, that's right. And so I touch back on that those microservices. There's a strategy here that it's not just adding on add-ins into your SAP environment. Okay, we're going to go do these other kind of third-party applications that are going to talk to it. And so, there's definitely interest in being able to coordinate the releases with this and find ways that we can get more incremental delivery within SAP. Only change what's necessary, and other stuff can wait later on until it's ready to be released.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's also an evolution here in SAP technology, which we're not going to get into today, that also means there's some more moving parts that might be connected to different tool chains, which maybe amplify the need for consideration of things like agile and DevOps in SAP. So to kind of wrap that up and summarize, I guess, this concept of this question of why care about SAP, and particularly if you're a developer or you work in applications where you think maybe SAP isn't in your day-to-day, it's not so important, you don't have to touch that, it's not your expertise. The thing that we're talking about here really these days is value streams that might go across the enterprise, as Erin has said, and those value streams that we're thinking about in a DevOps context might touch multiple different applications. They're quite likely to. So we've got every chance that if SAP is involved in that and it's working at a different cadence, again, as I said, maybe for good reasons, but maybe reasons we can address, then we might be holding back the whole value stream and the whole chain of delivery there, on certain occasions. And we talk about things like, for example, common in our customers is e-commerce front ends that rely on SAP backends and database and stock movement and supply chain, for example. So really, in many ways, everyone should care about SAP if we're in the IT world, because the business cares, because SAP helps to operate the business and a lot of those critical processes that make things work day to day. And therefore, treating SAP differently can lead us to cost and delay and frustration, and actually ultimately missed opportunity, that cost of not acting as quickly as we might. Because if other parts of the business rely on SAP, we definitely can't be truly agile. And even actually with SAP in isolation and trying to be more efficient there, there's benefits to be had if we can move faster. And if we can't be agile in SAP, even in isolation, perhaps our business can't really be agile. So bringing DevOps to SAP does really produce meaningful benefits of the kind, that we saw at the top of the presentation there. So let's talk a bit about SAP in particular. We've talked a bit about how the teams have a different approach to software change, and as I've said, there's a lot of backstory there. It's not something we're going to get into right now, but there are good and bad reasons for why that's happened and why the pace of change in SAP might be a bit slower. But it is definitely possible to align SAP with those DevOps initiatives and other applications. And if you're going to do that, what we've got on the screen here is a slide showing some of the things you really need to be aware of if you're going to try and make that happen. So we're not going to deep dive into all of these. If you're interested, you might want to check out a couple of our other webinars on the Basis Technologies website. But we're going to focus on that demo and that kind of visual example of how these things might fit together and how we might include SAP in a pipeline. But it is important to talk about a couple of these, which we're going to do now. So we're going to put culture to one side really for a minute, because you'll find in our experience there's a lot of commonality there between the cultural change you need in SAP to adopt DevOps and the kind of cultural change that you've implemented elsewhere or that you're aware of elsewhere. But let's focus for a couple of minutes instead on these technical differences and these technical issues, because these are really the things that play into that kind of automation scenario that we're talking about today. So, Erin, this slide, although it doesn't have too many words in it, it's actually covering an awful lot of ground, potentially for our audience today, especially if they're not familiar with SAP. So can you just give us a quick overview of what's on here and the kind of things that people need to be aware of from a technical and architectural point of view when they're thinking about DevOps in SAP?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when I introduced myself, I come from a Java, C#, JavaScript, web UI, front-end technologies. And so the biggest thing is I'm used to is a plethora of tooling. Version control is the core of all of that. And whether you're using Git or, Subversion back in the day and those kinds of things. Well, with SAP, you don't have that. It's essentially you're writing, your changes into a development server that is shared with maybe hundreds of other developers, and you're writing essentially the same objects. And so therefore now you have a sequencing challenge of what happens. And so there's no branching strategy. There's no local repositories and that sort of thing. So you have to coordinate these changes with all the other changes that are going on, as well as coordinate it with other non-SAP technology changes that are happening. And so it gets to be kind of a change and release burden, if you will, to be able to keep on top of that. So the code is written in a proprietary language from SAP called ABAP. So there's only one version live of that application or that piece of code at any one time. And the way you actually go through and start out writing this is in a development system. We call it a development server, which is the non-production version of SAP. And then you make the change there, and then you have to actually export it to this thing called a transport. It's a wrapper around that change that could have maybe a report, or it's a change to a table, or it's actually a configuration change where you're going to go add another company code. Okay, that all gets wrapped up in this transport. There's a timestamp who did it, and there's a version of it. And so now then you have to export it from your development system and then import it into the QA system, do testing there. If you have a pre-production system, do the same thing. And then finally it gets blessed and it goes into production. And all this is necessary because there's consequences in terms of being able to track who did what from an audit perspective. Sarbanes-Oxley concerns, and if I'm a regulated environment, me as a developer, I cannot approve my change and move forward and to the next system. Someone else has to do that. So and then keeping track of all those changes, the dependencies of those changes. Again, you're not just making one change one day. You're making hundreds of changes in that day, every single day, and then you have to bundle all that in terms of, hey, we're going to now release all of this change at one point in time. So it's very complex, and it's a completely different way of doing development.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think you've hit on some key points there, particularly from the typical DevOps paradigm. So as you've said, we're not able to power things from a version control system to drive a pipeline in SAP. We've got these issues like, it's technically possible perhaps to have multiple development environments to ease the burden on the developers, but the systems tend to be pretty huge. Databases tend to be pretty huge. It's not easy to replicate those systems. We've got this issue with configuration. So it's not just talking about code in SAP. We're not just talking about building stuff. Configuration, which can be much more nebulous in terms of impact and whether it's right or wrong, is really a consideration. So as Aaron has said there, quite a different kind of paradigm to what we need to to manage and how we need to go about thinking about a DevOps approach. And I'm sure some people can kind of guess what's coming next in terms of the impact of that, because really what this means is that established ecosystem of a lot of those really effective best of breed tools that Erin has talked about just aren't built to be compatible with SAP. So I mean, Erin, I guess this is one of the fundamental challenges around when we're talking about DevOps for SAP.
Yeah, that's right. And so, you know, the logos on the left don't know anything about transports with SAP. So, it's a completely different model in terms of how you do development. So, therefore, how would that kind of correlate that change is going to happen in my Node.js application that I'm, you know, hosting, or, you know, out of a Git repository, and using Jenkins to do you know, continuous integration, continuous delivery through its, you know, automatic builds and kicking off unit tests. How can I correlate that change to this other backend change I need to make, this configuration change in SAP, or even a, you know, a change in terms of how we do this, you know, calculate this report that it relies upon. So there's a big chasm there between the two technology sets.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, and this is what we're going to talk about today in terms of how we can both bridge this gap and also provide the means to adopt some of those kind of DevOps approaches within SAP as well. We're not going to go too deep on that, but we'll get a sense of that from that demo you're going to take us through. So, yep. Just a quick bit of backstory, or bit of introduction rather, for our audience before we get into the demo. The DevOps and test automation platform that is offered by us at Basis Technologies is obviously one of the ways that we can bridge that gap and try to bring DevOps into SAP. And we're not going to give you the big product pitch now, but this is going to be the basis for our demo. So just to set you up for what you're going to see, we've got two products in the platform there. We've got Testimony, which is a quite SAP specific and quite revolutionary way of doing regression testing that doesn't rely on test scripts. And we're not going to get into Testimony too much today, but we've also got Active Control, our change and release orchestration automation solution, which is going to give us is analogous to some of your CI/CD tools in the rest of your stack, but operating those functions for you in SAP. So to give you a sense of the idea of what this might look like, we've got this diagram here. Now, obviously, this is a kind of massively simplified situation, but hopefully this can give you a sense of this kind of two-sided story that I was talking about there. So with Active Control, we've got a tool there that can give you some of that functionality that you would expect in a CI/CD pipeline, but let's say with the ability to adapt that and deliver it in an SAP appropriate way, taking account of some of those specific considerations. But it also gives you the means to connect to some of those other tools that you're using in the rest of that tool chain, and thereby increase that automation across your tool chain and bring SAP into that deployment process from a point of view of visibility and potentially orchestration, and of course, as I've said, a greater degree of automation. So this is basically the concept that we're going to introduce in today's demo. Now, obviously, this is a kind of conceptual slide. It doesn't bear a great deal of relation to reality. You might be using completely different tools, many more tools maybe at different stages in the process. They might come in more than once. But hopefully this just gives you the idea of what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to do it to help you bring SAP into those pipelines you've already got. And this is kind of the concept that we're going to go through in the demo today. So let's do that now. I'm going to hand over to Erin to take you through an example, and admittedly a conceptual example of what that kind of connected workflow might look like, and hopefully that will give you some sort of inspiration and ideas of how that might relate to the kind of DevOps workflows you've got in your business. Okay. So Erin, over to you.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to do a very simple demonstration today. So we're going to have really two pieces of software that we're going to make changes in. So one of them is going to be a Java J2EE web app, the old toy store, okay? And so it's going to make a change there, but then the toy store actually gets its shipping information and pricing information from an SAP function module. This is a custom application that we have that basically will return to get the total price based upon what was selected in our toy shopping cart. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the flow and how this is actually going to, work going from beginning to end. So we do have a backlog, just like everything else that I've done, for a very long time. There's a backlog of stuff that we want to accomplish, and whether you're doing, Kanban, or if you're doing, Scrum or something like that, at some point in time, you prioritize it and you say, okay, go start doing work. Well, there's going to be a backlog manager that is going to essentially talk to both the Java side and then as well as the SAP side. And so I'll get into that a little bit. But of course, we have to make a change in our Java application, and then and of course, make a change within SAP. Well, and then we're going to have basically this kind of continuous integration, continuous delivery for both respective technologies. We're going to have to do some kind of automated testing to ensure that everything's okay. Of course, if it is, now we're going to go through and continuously deliver it to wherever we need to go. We're going to talk about some of the specific tools that are just going to be in this demonstration. For backlog management, we're going to use Azure DevOps. There's really no reason why we couldn't use Jira or ServiceNow or Sherwell or a host of other applications, but I just chose to use Azure DevOps for here. For the Java side, for the CI/CD engine, we're using Jenkins, open source, but you could use any other tooling out there. Again, Azure DevOps has that concept with pipelines, but you can use GitLab, GitHub Actions, doesn't matter. Active Control, our product, is going to be the CI/CD engine for SAP, and that's where I'm going to show a lot of the SAP changes, because the audience may not be aware of that. So I'll dig in a little more detail in terms of what's actually happening on the SAP side. Of course, we're going to host the Java application within Tomcat. SAP is the backend, of course. A notification engine, we're going to use a Slack just to notify, hey, build started, or you're eligible to start working on a particular change. UI automations, in Selenium, and then we're using Node-RED as an integration layer, as a middleware to be able to wire everything together. It's an open source technology, runs on Node.js. Okay, let's get into the demo. So we're going to start off with a backlog. In Azure DevOps, I've got my board here, that my Kanban board for the work we need to begin. And so we have an item that came in maybe from the business, and they want to enable shipping price for New Zealand. So I'm going to go take a look at the details for this particular item. And I can see that I actually have two changes. We need the shipping price should be 8. But then we also need to enable the shipping label for New Zealand within the Java application itself. And normally you may have like an epic that comes in for this, and then sub-user stories for each technology piece, and maybe some broken out simple work items. You can certainly do that with this approach, and that's more real world. But for this, we're just going to keep all this in terms of one user story within Azure DevOps. All right. Well, we're going to enable for this to begin. So we're going to say, okay, let's go ahead and make dev in progress. When I do that, it's going to kick off some automation. And we're actually going to, through Node-RED, it's going to kick that off. I've got a Slack message here, and I can see that it's saying that business task toy 115 is created and ready for development within, for SAP development. Well, what that means is that it's actually created a corresponding, what we call a business task within Active Control. This is the Active Control user interface. And really, this is telling me everything that I need to do for all the changes that are responsible for me, for my approval, for my testing, the changes for in progress transports, all the stuff that is assigned to me. This is what I need to do. Well, I'm going to come in and I'm going to say, okay, let me go look at that specific business task. And so I'm going to search for it, and then there it is. I can come in, I can take a look at the details. We could have brought over a lot of this, metadata about the change from Azure DevOps if we wanted to. But I want to go and look at the transports, the changes that are related to in the SAP side. Well, here I actually want to go through and make that change in SAP. I don't have any transports yet because I haven't started doing that development. Let's begin to do that. I'm going to go into SAP. And I've loaded up the function module we're going to make the change to. I'm going to hit change, and I will load up this ABAP code. So this is the IDE, if you will. And so here I'm actually going to uncomment out the change for looking for a destination code of New Zealand. If so, it will set the shipping price to 8. Again, I talked about how we need to move this code from our development system, because I'm in my development D01 system at this point in time. And then we need to actually turn it into a transport. It's an SAP technology or terminology for wrapping this particular change in a description and who did it. And we need to bring it from our dev system going into our QA system, do testing there, and then I also need to go through and bring it into production. Well, so the first thing I need to do is I need to activate this particular change. And when I do that, SAP says, hey, you need to actually create a transport request, this kind of wrapper around this particular change, or attach it to an existing transport. Here I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this shipping price. I'm going to hit save, create. Okay, now active control, this is a user interface that from our product active control, it wants a little bit more information about this, because as soon as I create this transport, active control, the CI/CD engine for SAP is going to take over and is going to manage this from its entire life cycle, going from dev to QA to production. So I really need to specify what type of change it is. It's a workbench change, what group it belongs with. So this is going to be SD, sales and delivery, and then what's transport path. So this is that path going from dev to QA to production. We only have one, and so I'm going to select ECC. ECC is the ERP application for SAP. Great. Now then, I need to actually tie it to the Azure DevOps item. Okay, remember how we created that business task a little bit earlier on through the integration? Well, I'm going to go look for that business task. I know what the number of it was. It was toy 115. I'm going to go specify that it should be a new task. And then I'm just going to go through and search. 5. Okay, now I'm going to look for it. There it is. Great. The thing that's different also about SAP is that there really isn't a compiler. I'm used to actually writing, C# in Visual Studio or Java and NetBeans or IntelliJ, and so therefore I have a compiler, okay. And there's other analyzers that tell me if I'm doing some things wrong with my code, coding standards and those kinds of things. You don't really have that within SAP. So what we need is a tool, the CI/CD engine, and back to control, to run this analysis for me and tell if I'm going to have problems. And so as soon as I hit save, now active control is going to run this analysis. It would tell me if there was a problem. In this case, there is no problem. Great. Wonderful. And go ahead and save that out. Okay. I come back to active control. I'm going to refresh. And now I see that particular transport. So this business task only has one transport associated with it, but it could have multiple. But in this case, we're going to keep it simple and only have one. Okay. Fantastic. I've made that change in my development system. And just to show you where that path is going from development, our D01 system, I can come here and take a look and show you the development path. So this is my development D01, and then there's a TO1 for a QA system or a test system, and then IO1 is production. Some customers may have a pre-prod instance or multiple QA, systems in between this path. So therefore, there's different levels of verification, if you will, and validation of these changes. But this is the flow that it has to go through in order to get to be imported into production.
And Aaron, if I could just jump in there, I think it's
Sure.
an important point for our audience. I think you demonstrated really well there visually one of the key differences between what they might be used to if they work outside of SAP and what you're showing here is that we don't have this concept of multiple development environments for different developers to be working in independently. Yeah. We don't have the concept of A/B testing and different kind of rollouts and maybe different front ends for different audiences. We've got that one production server, and that's where all the changes happen, and that's where everything is going to go live. potentially all at the same time, depending on your deployment patterns. But it's quite that kind of different paradigm.
That's correct. Yeah, it's totally different. So therefore, we need tooling specially designed to think about that in that manner. Okay, so I've made that change, and I actually, as part of this, I need to say that I've actually done my testing as a developer in this development environment. So I'm going to come here, enter test results, and say, yes, testing was successful. I'm going to select this transport I tested on, and I say, success. We could attach a file or a screenshot or a URL to it. Now, as soon as I hit save and approve testing, active control or run some analysis. There's 70 plus analyzers that can be run at any point of that workflow going from dev to production. And then so here it's going to run some, it's going to look at it to see if I have any problems. Sequencing challenges and these kinds of things, and dependency detection, a lot of problems that can happen because of the transport technology. Well, there was no problem there, and now it moved to the next step in the workflow. Here it's sitting at the outbox of our development system. It hasn't left. Normally, an email notification would be sent to one of these people to say, hey, Aaron's created this transport. He's tested it successfully. Please log into Active Control and approve it to move forward. This is another opportunity for rigor to look for any type of changes or defects. Well, in this case, everything's okay. Before I do that, though, remember I had to make that change over there in Java. So let me switch my Java hat on and go into NetBeans here, and then let me go ahead and make that change for the label. I have it commented out to here, and I'm going to uncomment. So I'll talk about that particular shipping change of $8. I'll hit save. Now I would do a build, run it locally, see if everything's okay, and then I would commit it into a source control repository. In my demo here, I'm cheating a little bit because I don't really have a Git repository set up. Everything's local to my machine, including Jenkins is right there. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. So I made the Java change, but now I actually got to go finish the SAP change in terms of approving it to move forward. Let's go back to Active Control. Great. I'm going to hit approve. All right. And which transport am I going to approve? It's that one. It's running analysis. Oh, it caught an issue. So just like CodeSmith I had in the .NET world, okay, so this is where, or FX Copper, those kinds of things. We have something in SAP for SAP Code Inspector, and it says that, hey, I actually have some incorrectly named variables that doesn't match our coding standard. This is just one example of some of the analysis that we can catch. Again, our goal is to identify these defects before they leave dev, because it's so much easier and cheaper to remediate those issues than having a QA team come in and test for it and find some other problems. Not that they would probably find the locally a named variable problem, but you get the sense of with that shift left testing, run that analysis earlier on in the release process. Here, I'm just going to say approve anyway. When I do that, I have to give it a reason. Hey, it's a demo. Okay, and I click OK. Great. And now then we're going to go through. And now it moves to the next step in the workflow. Again, we would notify other people, but it's waiting in this inbox for my QA environment. It hasn't been imported in yet, but it's waiting for further scrutiny. And so therefore we notify these people, they would come in and they would have to come in and enter their approval. Okay.
And I guess, Aaron, that's similar to the kind of notifications or the kind of pipeline you might have in a version control system if you don't have everything like that fully automated, and if you're in sensitive systems where you need approvals, you might be keying that off your version control outside of SAP, and active control is acting as that role inside SAP.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Well, when I actually hit approve and import, it's actually going to kick off the import routine for this particular transport to be imported into our QA system. And this is where some other, integration magic is going to occur. If I go back over to Azure DevOps, I can see I've got another column over here. And this is QA in progress. And what this does is that this is basically notifying the entire team that, hey, we're starting to do some QA. Again, I want to automate everything as much as possible. When this gets imported in, Active Control is going to notify Azure DevOps to update the status of this to QA in progress. It's also going to kick off this Jenkins pipeline to kick off the Java side of things and run some kind of testing against that. And so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to watch this, and then let me go in and approve and import. Again, which one are we going to approve? That transport, and so therefore I'm going to have approve anyway, and the demo, because there's other issues with it. Say okay, great. Now then, that kicks off the import queue. Okay, and then let me go back over into here, and let's see, it's going to kick that off in any minute or any second now, and let's see, it's going to go, oh, there it is. And so now we've gone through and we've kicked that off. And we go back over to Jenkins, and so we should have a new build that kicks off pretty soon. And there it is. And all this is happening through a piece of middleware here in Node-RED. And that's what we're seeing, this particular flow for when we have this deployment status webhook coming from Active Control that kicks us off to update the Azure DevOps story item, send out the Slack message, and then kick off the Jenkins build. You don't have to use Node-RED. You can use MuleSoft if you have it, or API Gateway if you're on AWS, or TIBCO, or a number of technologies. This one is just open source. Okay, so we're kicking this off, and now then it is moving forward, and we're running a Selenium test. Running it, and away we go.
So Aaron, again, I guess it's worth mentioning that obviously people in the audience will recognize that this is a simple example, but the concept that we talked about with the tooling being, the world's your oyster could be completely different, also applies to the workflow that you're showing here as well. Of course, lots of possibilities for how this could be configured and how this could work and what the triggers could be.
That's right. That's right. And so testing of success, it went through, it validated everything. It also runs some Java unit tests, and that I already updated previously to look for the number 8 in New Zealand. And so therefore everything went through just fine at that point. And then we go through and save the result back to Active Control, and then it moves that particular transport be eligible to be imported into production. We could be notifying other QA members to come in and do their QA, and then they would have to track that result within Active Control as well if you want to do that, or you can just go through and say, hey, everything is fine, we fully automate it, you trust the automation, you trust the testing, and now it's eligible to be imported into production. At the same time, we could then deploy this particular Java change to production as well through Jenkins. Okay. Let's kind of go through talk about the end-to-end flow.
Just to recap before you finish, I think it's really important to point out that obviously what we get as we move those changes through into our maybe pre-production SAP system or our production SAP system is all the rigor that you were talking about in terms of the automated checks,
right?
Kind of safety first approach that is one of the big concerns of the SAP teams, so that even when you are moving fast, you have the opportunity to put those controls in where you need them and have all that information at your fingertips so you can have that confidence in a more automated process.
Yeah, that's right. And that automation, that rigor, that repeatable rigor is a big portion of that. Then it eliminates the technical release defects, which is one of the reasons why people tend to go slowly when they're releasing to SAP changes, because there's so much that can go wrong because of the architecture of transports. So therefore, if you have more rigor, you have more analysis, you identify the problems earlier on, and there's more confidence before you actually can go deploy into production, well, you're naturally going to start to go faster. You're going to have smaller releases that they're isolated, has no dependencies on anything else that's still being developed, and then you can go and release that at a faster cadence. We have some companies that release, daily now based upon certain types of changes, because they know that all the testing and all approvals are satisfied. We can go ahead and release at that faster cadence, and so it's a big jump from the old twice a year releases or quarterly releases going to daily. Okay, so let's talk about review what we was part of this flow. So the backlog management, that was in Azure DevOps. Again, you can use Jira, ServiceNow if you have a ticket come in. It doesn't really matter, or a combination of anything really. Of course, Java side, that was using Tomcat. Jenkins was the CI/CD engine. Active Control was this continuous integration, continuous delivery aspect for SAP, responsible for all that. And then we use Selenium for some automated testing. There's some Java unit tests in there as well. There could be ABAP unit tests for the ABAP side. And the glue to everything, keeping everything sync, was Node-RED, is the integration layer. Of course, we're using Slack for notifications, but hey, you can use Teams if you wanted to as well. It doesn't really matter.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And obviously, okay, jumped ahead slightly, but that's all right. Just going to round that off to say I think it's also important, particularly for people who might be bringing their DevOps expertise to help the SAP team. As I say, to remember these kind of two levels, we've got potential to improve and transform the way we run these processes within SAP, potentially maybe before we try and go for this kind of more ambitious, more integrated workflow. And that's something we see with quite a lot of our clients. They start off with more automation in SAP, and as they work out their processes, they can figure out how to fit them into those broader workflows and leverage the other tools that they've got most effectively and where they get most bang for their buck.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that brings us on nicely to the roundup of today's conversation. Actually, I just want to say before that, I just wanted to go slightly off track and say hi to Nicole, who's just pointed out in the chat that she is one of those companies, one of our clients on the chat. They're one of those companies that went to those daily SAP deliveries on a Monday to Friday basis. So thanks for joining us, Nicole. So yeah, the benefits of SAP DevOps automation. I said at the start, okay, we've got these great stats for DevOps and everybody knows that they're there, but they don't really apply to SAP, for most places. But the truth is, if you get the right automation into SAP and you can connect that to those kind of tool chains you've got and bring those similar kind of concepts and processes into SAP, I guess you wouldn't be surprised to hear that we do see similar kinds of outcomes, and we do see the kind of benefits that are on the screen here within SAP environments, and particularly things like that, manual effort stat, which is pretty huge in the world of SAP, as Aaron has described, with a lot of those spreadsheets and emails and detailed management of complexity if you don't have the automation tools in place. So hopefully that's given you a bit of food for thought and some ideas about how you can help your colleagues in the SAP world to work better, or if you're working in SAP already, to bring some of these DevOps ideas to bear into those workflows that you've got there. Let's just wrap things up for today. We're almost on time, slightly over where we meant to be. As we said right at the top, we believe that DevOps professionals should consider SAP for a number of good reasons. It may well be in your own benefit to do so. It's almost certainly going to be in the company's benefit to do so, to try and share that knowledge and bring those together. DevOps and SAP teams together can both benefit from a more integrated tool chain. And when we say DevOps teams there, of course, we mean development teams, outside of SAP, working on other technologies and applications. But that standard DevOps approach isn't just a lift and shift into SAP. There are some particular technologies we've got to think about, some architectural requirements, and some of that's going to require some specific automation. Some of it's going to require an adaptation of our processes and how we actually look at what we consider to be DevOps. But it is achievable in SAP today, albeit maybe in a slightly different or adapted form, and it is delivering real benefits for companies. And some of them have already started to make that journey towards those more integrated tool chains, so that they can have a more orchestrated and automated value chain across multiple applications with SAP as a part of that. So that just about wraps us up for today. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us and to sticking with us until the end here. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A in a moment in the few minutes we've got left. But in the meantime, if you'd like any more information about these kind of topics around how SAP can fit into those kind of DevOps workflows in your organization, do please feel free to get in touch with us either at our website, or you can see Aaron's email address on the screen there. He'd love to receive your emails directly and happy to engage with you on any conversation there. We'll leave this up for a couple of minutes while we just do a quick bit of Q&A. So let's take a quick look at some of the questions that have come in. I just want to click into this one quickly because I think it's really important for people who are more familiar with a standard DevOps approach, Aaron. One of our attendees has asked again about what about if we want to try and source control SAP changes and we want to go for that kind of more version control approach that we're used to in a DevOps world.
Yeah, so traditionally, it just wasn't an option. I mean, the only way to do that is to start off in a development environment. Keep in mind, like the ECC for SAP, that their ERP environment, I think it has something like 35,000 base tables and then objects on top of that. So, as a developer, I'm used to, all my source code, is in Java, and I build the entire thing. When I make a change and I just move the jars to someplace, all of it for testing. That's just not possible with that. There's terabytes of data as well for SAP. So therefore you have to go through and do things in pieces. There are some technology, some open source technology that they're trying to do this. One of those is ABAP Git. We did a prototype with that for TechEd in 2019. We partnered with a customer to see if that works, to try to do Docker containers for ECC environment, so you have your own localized development system. It just doesn't meet prime time. It's just not quite ready yet. There's some objects you can't use with it, and then as well as just doesn't handle configurations and a number of challenges. There are some stuff coming out in SAP GCTS, and that's for the latest and greatest versions of SAP. Not many customers are going to be on them, but we are starting to work on exploring that kind of concept with some of our key customers as well to see, where are the gaps with that technology that are really ready for prime time. But for most part, there is no version control, and so therefore you have to use a tool like Active Control to help keep all the changes in sync going across everything.
Okay, thanks. I think we've obviously got at least one or two people on the call who are a bit more in SAP world. Got a question here. Can we use this approach for non-ABAP SAP development? And what
Yeah, so it's certainly, ABAP transport is the key part of that, but there's other types of a change that is not ABAP, but it is transportable change. So you think of like, Fiori for the UI5 technology, a lot of it is, going to be XML or Java, JavaScript files and those kinds of things. And that's great. You do that development. Sure, you can use a source control system, but at some point in time, you got to deploy that to a dev system. It matches up to the ABAP stack of that, as well as going into a QA and then a production. So there is transportable change at that point in time. And that control can manage all of that. There's Java transports as well. And for, BW and these kinds of technologies that they have at SAP. And then Active Control can manage all of that.
Okay, thanks. Question around, I guess, that middleware piece. Question is asking basically what the alternatives might be to Node-RED that would work in this kind of scenario.
Yeah, really, there's a ton of them out there. MuleSoft is very popular, and TaskTop is one. TIBCO's been around for a long time. Web Methods, we've got one customer that uses API Gateway, and because they host everything on AWS, so it doesn't really matter. It's just all about mapping HTTP endpoints and being able to whatever that specific logic that is important to your company in terms of how you want to operate. You can use it. Active Control has APIs that Node-RED talks to, or MuleSoft, or anyone else.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple more before we're up to time. Very broad one here, but maybe you can sort of briefly speak to the possibilities. One question is asking who gives the approvals. Presumably, I guess we're talking about the SAP change here, but It's a little bit how long is a piece of string, but I'll let you.
Right. So some companies have very simple approval mechanisms. You have the approval for work to begin. You maybe have a Scrum manager or a product owner or something like that. Of course, you develop it, you make the change, and then you may have a team lead, And so that's where the op box of that development system comes in. Your team lead wants to look at the changes and do a code review with you or something. And so there's approval there. Of course, you have change and release managers along the way, probably. And then, of course, there's the QA team. They have to approve it. They have to do the testing at QA and do their approvals. And you may actually have, cab approvals before things go into production. So it's very dependent upon each organization and how they do change and release with SAP.
And I think, just to add a bit of color to that, because we're talking very sort of functional foundational processes, you might also have functional experts and SMEs involved in that process. And as you said, although what we're striving for is kind of as much automation as possible, there's very low appetite for risk, justifiably often in SAP. So there's lots of opportunity to manage that in the way that you're most comfortable with. And we even see with these kind of integrations that we're talking about, some organizations, particularly maybe at the CAB stage for final production approval of the live changes, they want to drive that from a tool like a Jira or a ServiceNow, where they can see the big picture very easily of everything that's happening. And we can set these things up such that pushing that user story or requirement in those external tools into the relevant status can automatically make that change within SAP or elsewhere. So lots of possibilities there. Final question, I think, here, Erin. I think you've covered this, but just to clear it up, obviously, as I say, at least a couple of people on the call who know SAP. And the question is asking whether they can deploy customization items or only workbench requests.
Oh, you can do any type of change. You can deploy that. So if you have the customizing change, which is like we call it configuration change, adding a new company code or something like that. Yeah, that's all transportable change, and all that can be managed through Active Control.
So I think that's pretty much all our questions. I think we're pretty much up to time, because I know I need to give a couple of minutes back for a bit of housekeeping at the end. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. If there are any questions that we didn't get to, we'll try and get to those offline. And as we said, if you'd like to get in touch and discuss any of the things we've talked about today, or how our automation might be able to help in your organization with spreading DevOps, particularly to SAP, then do please feel free to get in touch. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. So thank you to everybody who did submit questions, Stan, Rama, and all the others who did submit questions. So thank you very much. There were some really great ones that came in. So yeah, as Peter said, if we didn't get to your question, please know that the folks at Basis will be getting a copy of all the questions that came in. I am sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Also, a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. We are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand shortly after this webinar. So you can always go watch it on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living there on the devops.com website. So you can find it there as well. Just go to devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. It should be right there waiting for you. Okay, before we close things out, let's go ahead and do that drawing for the 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our winners today, our first winner, drum roll, is Christy L. Congratulations, Christy. Our second winner today is Alex M. Congratulations, Alex. Our third winner today is, I think it's Vu or VU. N, congratulations. And our fourth and final winner today is Julian A. Congratulations, Julian. We'll be following up with all four of you via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. And if you don't see anything there, please check your spam folder. Peter and Erin, what a great conversation between the two. What a great presentation. I love the demos. I always say that. I love the demos. So thank you so much for your time and your experience today and for sharing it with us. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene.
I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.
Thank you.